Now, in verses 18 through 34, the second half of chapter 8, Matthew draws together the four questions we talked about last week into a single question, into a single concern, sort of like tributaries flowing into a river. The question, who is this guy, is on the lips of those who ought to know Jesus best. That's ironic enough in and of itself. But the answer to that question and how that answer comes to us, the reader, only intensifies the irony. So let's begin by looking at verses 18 through 22 and see how Matthew sets up the question. How does he frame this whole mental operation that the disciples are undergoing? Well, he frames it with the idea of discipleship. He's already broached the idea of discipleship at least as early as chapter 7. But now he really drives home this idea of discipleship. He references it in verse 18. He references it again in verse 20 or 21. He references it again in verse 23. For whatever reason, Matthew really wants us to understand that everything we're about to read is set in this context of discipleship. I don't think Matthew's reasoning is actually that obscure. Of course, he's setting a narrative framework for the issues that he wants us to entertain. But the obligations that Jesus is going to lay upon those who follow him will necessitate that we ask this question, who is this guy? Who does he think that he is to ask so much of us? Of course, that's not why the disciples are asking the question, but Matthew strongly implies that that's why we might ask the question. Now, how does he do that? Well, notice that especially the first, but also the second, prospective disciple who comes to Jesus gets it right. They understand that, at least in a rudimentary sense, following or being Jesus' disciple, I should say, is about following Jesus. It's about walking with him, walking after him. Now, in the second century, as Houston Theological Seminary professor Lynn Cohick pointed out to us this week at B.H. Carroll, in the second century, they would reframe this idea a little bit more in Pauline language. They would talk about the imitation of Christ. But it's the same idea. When you are walking with, when you are following a teacher, you are not only listening to that teacher, you are imitating that teacher. So at its bottom, these prospective disciples got it right. They understood what discipleship was about. What does Jesus do? He puts obstacles in the path of their discipleship. Now, we could dig around in what Jesus is talking about here and really ask some interesting questions, but I want to just keep us moving, and I want to keep us thinking about our own circumstance, okay? Because ultimately, Matthew wants us to apply this gospel to our community of faith, to our situation, just as he wanted his own congregation or congregations to apply it to their context. So what's the first obstacle that Jesus throws in the path of these prospective disciples? Well, notice what he says there in verse 19. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Now, we need to be clear about something. A lot of popular interpreters, and even some pastors and teachers, will say, oh, well, Jesus was homeless because of this text right here. Unfortunately, we've already seen in Matthew that Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. He probably had a home there. So what is Jesus saying? Well, what he's saying is, we're going to be moving around a lot. We're going to be going from place to place to place. If you're looking for a world of comfort and stability, if you're looking, I should say, a life of comfort and stability, I'm not your guy. And he says that, notice, to the expert in the law, the NIV translates it, to the scribe, to the person who is the practicing theologian. Now, we theologians tend to like our creature comforts. We like to sit in our study and read and contemplate. And there's a place for that. But there's also a place for getting up out of your study and getting out among the people. I think that this obstacle that Jesus puts in the way of this man's discipleship is particularly apropos for the American church. We have sometimes a fine way of saying, well, we want this problem solved, or we want this addressed, or we want this done, as long as it doesn't cost us anything. Just this week, Russell Moore was interviewing Kelly Rosati, who's been a long-time activist in anti-abortion politics, but she's also been a long-time advocate for orphans and foster care and lots of other things related to pro-life causes. She's been doing this for 20 years, and one of the things that she's noticed is churches they'll march for life on one Sunday a year. They'll say from the pulpit, hey, you need to go and adopt these kids out of the foster care system. But when families actually take that advice and do that very, very, very hard thing, they haven't been providing them the support that they need. And there have been a lot of families that have been wrecked by an honest attempt to follow Jesus into the most painful parts of our society without the proper support. Let's translate that into maybe a slightly different sphere. I remember several years ago, Natalia and I were reading Tom Rainer's book, Autopsy of a Deceased Church. It's a fantastic book, and it's short and easy to read. If you ever get a chance, you ought to read it. But he was talking about a pastor friend of his that was going to a church that needed revitalization. And the pastor did his due diligence. He asked the search committee, what is it that you want? And the search committee said, we want to grow. We know we need to change. We want to reach our community better. And so the candidate accepted the position. 18 months later, they're getting ready to fire him. And he actually went to one of the members of the committee and said, what gives? I thought you guys said you were ready to change. And the committee member said, well, we didn't mean that kind of change. And as Natalia has so often observed, what they wanted was a change in results without a change in methodology. Natalia and I lived this in the last church where I was on staff. People in the church were all for community involvement as long as the youth did it. As long as they didn't have to give up their Saturday, their Tuesday night, their whatever it was. It seems a little harsh to criticize a church that way. And even I feel the discomfort. But the truth is, that's how it was. We don't want to be that way. We need to remember that if you're looking for stability and comfort, sometimes Jesus is not the one you're looking for. So now let's move to there in verses 21 and 22. It gets even more uncomfortable, right? Because the disciple comes to Jesus and says, well, I want to follow you, but I've got to go bury my father. And Jesus says to him, let the dead bury their own dead. Now, there's some things that we could say that would soften the blow of Jesus' words, okay? Because Jesus knows that you're supposed to honor your father and mother. And in his culture, there was no more basic obligation than to bury one's parents. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to soften the blow of what Jesus says here. I want it to confront us and to offend us a little bit. Because what Jesus is saying is that discipleship may require us to lay aside our most treasured norms of familial care. And already what we're seeing is that the kingdom of God is not a different priority than these other priorities. It's not one that we can kind of just say, well, we have this carefully crafted hierarchy. God, and then family, and then church, and then nation, and then, no. The kingdom of God permeates everything. The kingdom of God is all-consuming. Jesus is trying to offend. Why? Because he wants you to understand what it really means to be a disciple. Now let me tell you, this is not always easy. There are not always clear answers, okay? Missionary kids throughout the last 50 or 100 years have complained bitterly that their parents seemed to love everybody else in the world more than them. And kids cannot live that way. That does not raise healthy children. Even when William Carey went to India, and the work that he did in India was extremely valuable, extremely important. But William Carey goes to India with his wife and his kids. And not long after he gets there, his son dies. And his wife is so distraught that she loses her mind. Not exaggerating. Now, to his credit, he found a way to balance all of this. He would not put her in an institution. His feeling was, I brought her here. I made her go through all of this that she didn't want to go through. The least I can do is be the one who cares for her. And he did until her dying day. But the gospel sometimes will cost us more than we really want to pay. Now, because of that, the third obstacle, we sometimes live under a cloud of suspicion. That may be part of what Jesus is talking about when he tells the first guy, hey, look, foxes have holes, birds have nests. Why? Because see, if you're a teacher, if you're a traveling teacher, the rules of hospitality should always care for you. But Jesus may be saying, hey, look, we're not always going to have a place to sleep. And if you don't, that means that people in that particular area they're not sure what to think about you. But you know what? The biggest obstacle to discipleship, the biggest obstacle to faith, is the rest of our text this morning. It's the places where Jesus will lead us. When Jesus told his disciples to pray, do not lead us into, whether you translate that temptation or the time of testing, I think he meant it. Because what does Jesus do? He leads his disciples into a storm. And then right after that, he leads them into enemy territory. He will do the same with us. He will lead us into storms. I remember when I was a senior in college, it was 1997, 1998 academic year. And one of my professors was being courted by Southwestern Seminary to come on their faculty. Now, at one level, all of us, we were honored, that he was being considered for this position where he wouldn't just be teaching undergrads, he'd be teaching master's level and PhD level students. It was a step up from a career point of view. But frankly, given the state of Southern Baptist politics, both then and now, I and several of my other friends told him, don't go. Don't go. It's a trap. It's going to go badly. And we were right. And I have long wondered, did he miss God? Did he miss what Jesus was telling him to do? And it's very possible that he didn't. If you'll remember in Acts, I think it's about chapter 19 or so, chapter 19, chapter 20. Paul is going to Jerusalem, and the Spirit is telling him all along the way, if you go to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be persecuted. And the people who are with Paul are begging him, don't go. And at one point, Paul tells them, stop breaking my heart. Sometimes Jesus leads us into storms. And that may have been exactly what he was doing with my professor. Sometimes he even leads us into enemy territory. And it's in that context that our question comes up. That's where the disciples ask the question. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff we could talk about in this text. So at some point, we'll have to come back and talk about that. But I want us to think about this question. They're asking, what kind of person is this? Or, in our language, who is this guy? They're amazed and frankly, probably a little afraid. It's one of the things that can be communicated by that Greek term is an amazement and astonishment that borders on fear. Now, on the one hand, we're kind of like, well, why should these guys be amazed? They've been palling around with Jesus for a while now. They've seen him heal diseases with a touch. They've seen him cast out demons with a word. But nature is something else. Psalm 104, Psalm 106, Psalm 107, Psalm 109. Several of these Psalms, as well as the book of Job, make it clear that nature is the domain of God's power. Human beings don't have the power to control nature. You'll see a very occasional nature miracle in the Old Testament. But even in a few of those, the human isn't the active agent. Think about the parting of the Red Sea. It's actually the pillar of cloud and fire. God is the one who is in charge of nature. And these guys don't have a category for a divine Messiah. Even if they understand that Jesus is God's anointed one, it's very difficult for them to conceive of him in divine terms. But here he is doing something that only God is supposed to be able to do. So they're astonished and afraid. Now, how is their question answered? Isn't that interesting? I told you before that they are journeying into enemy territory. They were moving towards the southeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That was Gentile territory. And we know that it was Gentile territory, because of our archaeology and all that kind of stuff, but also because there was a herd of pigs there. And at least one source tells us that Jews wouldn't even raise pigs, not even to sell to Gentiles. They were unclean. So, what do you have here? Who are these two people that come and greet Jesus in this odd way? They are Gentiles. But it's not these Gentile men in and of themselves that answer the question. It's the demons that possess them. So I want you to imagine this from a purity, impurity standpoint, from a standpoint of classic Israelite religion. You can't get any more unclean, basically, than two guys who are Gentiles, who are demon-possessed, and who live next door to a large herd of pigs. That's just about as unclean as you can get. Now, Mark and Luke add some layers to that uncleanness, but we won't even get into all that. These guys are as unclean as it gets. They are as far, remember what unclean means. It means they are as far away from God as one can imagine. And yet, as soon as they see Jesus, their response is, "What are you doing here, Son of God?" They have rightly identified who Jesus is. Now, in the Old Testament, divine sonship language could be used in a variety of ways. It most often represented a human king of Israel. There was no divine attribute implied in that title. You see it again and again in the Psalms, in these kingship psalms. It's not real frequent, but it's there. But Matthew takes this language and he reinterprets it. Matthew subtly but clearly helps us understand that when these demons call Jesus Son of God, they are not saying King of Israel. They are saying something much more profound. They are making a claim about his identity and his nature. It is a claim that is reminiscent of everything that we read in John's Gospel. But here it is in Matthew. Now, that claim has some very important implications. One of them is explicit. Jesus has power over these demons. The demons are frustrated. That little phrase there at the beginning of their interaction with Jesus, it's literally, if you were to read it in Greek, you would read, "What to me and to you?" And you'd be thinking, huh? What does this mean? Well, that's an idiom. And among other things, it can mean, what are you doing here? Or even, go away. It's an expression of exasperation. And it emphasizes the disjunction between the two conversation parties. The fact that they don't agree, that they aren't together, that they don't see things the same way. And the demons, their complaint is, are you here to torture us before the appointed time? But if Jesus says, yeah, that's why I'm here, there's not anything they can do about it. Another implication is that we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus has power over nature. This is the answer to the disciples' question. How in the world can Jesus do what he did? Well, here's how. He's the Son of God. That's how. There's another implication here. Jesus is to be feared. It is, the people in the neighborhood there, I've always kind of had a negative view of them. They don't seem to care at all about these two men who have been delivered from demonic oppression. They seem to only care about their pigs and about themselves. But there is a genuine awe, a genuine fear that they have, and it's appropriate. It's appropriate. Now, I want to make one more observation, okay? And it's not specifically related to this sort of question and answer cycle, but it's not directly related, but it's indirectly related, and it's very important. Okay? Have you ever asked yourself, well, why doesn't Jesus just deliver these guys? Why does he allow the demons to go into the pigs? Why this wanton waste of life? There's actually, New Testament professors who teach at the undergraduate level have observed that that's a question a lot of their students are asking. Well, if Jesus is really all that great, why the slaughter of these pigs? It's an interesting question. As we've already said, if Jesus had wanted to just throw them out, he could have. He does it plenty of times throughout his ministry. He just exorcises demons, sends them away. Why doesn't he do that here? I think there's a very clear reason he doesn't do that here. He wants to exemplify what he has already said in the Sermon on the Mount. These men are worth more to God than pigs. It doesn't matter how many pigs there are. These men are worth more to God than pigs. And if Jesus just sort of sent the demons off, we would never quite get that. It would never occur to us. But these men, Jesus shows us, are worth more than the pigs themselves or than the economic benefit that they bring to the town. Jesus is Son of God. And He alone has the right to make that distinction, and He does. There's nothing to recommend these men. Matthew does not tell his story the way that Mark and Luke do to try to build empathy for the men. No, in Matthew's story, these guys are just a nuisance. And yet Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee through a storm into enemy territory to rescue these men. And He is saying, they matter to God and they matter to me. Now, let's draw all that together. Following Jesus can feel a little bit like grabbing a tiger by the tail. We never know where the road of discipleship is going to lead or what we're going to go through to get there. Yet Matthew has already made it clear to us that discipleship is the way to life. If we want to live, and we all do, then discipleship is the way to life. And in our text, Matthew explains why that's true. It's true because Jesus is the Son of God. Now, as we'll see later, it's true for some other reasons too. We'll talk about atonement when we get to Christ's crucifixion. We'll talk about His victory over death when we get to the resurrection. But at the outset, what we've already learned is that Christ is the Son of God. That means that He has the right to place obligations upon us that no one else can place on us. No one else, not your pastor, not your deacon, not anybody coming in from the outside, has the right to ask the things of you that Jesus asks of you. And that's just as well, because only Christ can provide what we really need. I can't save you. Roy can't save you. The new executive director of the Baptist General Convention of Texas can't save you. Bishop Burns over at the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth can't save you. Heaven knows there's not a politician alive that can save you or save us. No. What we need can only be provided by Jesus. But it can be provided by Jesus because He is the Son of God. Let us pray.